Thank you to all our speakers. We've done what we usually do, as the British government does too. We take things up right to the deadline and then we go over it a little bit. So my apologies for that, but it shows you the extraordinary complexity of the topic at hand. The devil really is in the detail, as Eloise has just shown. It's also come to my mind just how appropriate now the EU motto is: unity and diversity. Unity in diversity, be it within the UK as the devolved administrations will become ever more vocal about what they need and want going forward, be it in the EU where I suppose the member states will also become more vocal about what they need and want going forward in phase 2, about constitutional matters, about policy matters and trade. So a vast field. I will at the moment decide to go straight to you because you have been sitting there extremely patiently, and I suppose there will be lots of questions coming from you. Dominic, extension.
As has been highlighted, the bill that is just going through provides that there will be no extension to transition as a matter of UK law. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't happen, because as we have seen on previous occasions, Parliament can make a law and Parliament can change a law. But it does mean that if we were to extend transition, it would be necessary for the Prime Minister to introduce into the House of Commons a bill amending this Act so that you remove the prohibition on extending transition. Politically, that may be feasible, but it highlights that the Prime Minister has definitely nailed his colours to the mast pretty firmly that he doesn't intend to do this. Now, I've been fascinated by his motivation, because whether it's to try to emphasise to the EU that he really means what he's saying on transition, or whether it's to emphasise to his ERG supporters that he really means what he says about transition, and perhaps it's an element of both. And it's very much in keeping with his style of approach, which he adopted in August and September of this year, when he sent out a very powerful message, or sought to, before reprobates like me derailed it, that he was willing to take us out of the EU with absolutely no deal at all, and indeed was going to prorogue Parliament to try to make sure that he could do it, which is what led to the Benn Act and my being thrown out of the Conservative Party, something for which I have no regrets whatsoever. The simple answer is that legally, yes, of course, Parliament makes law, Parliament can change law. That is, the feature of the UK Constitution. But he certainly made a number of clear political obstacles to doing it, and I think we need to proceed on the assumption, despite his rather odd comment last weekend, that he's going to be in some difficulty politically changing this. And that'd be one thing, I suppose, to extend for 8 weeks so as to allow some deal to be finalised. But it's another thing for him to say we're going to extend transition by another year, when, as I said at the very start of my remarks, those people who are going to celebrate in Parliament Square on the 31st of January at 11 p.m. are actually celebrating first 11 months of vassalage before total freedom is achieved, and they are going to be disappointed.
Thank you. Stefan, the Irish Sea.
I won't dwell on comments I haven't seen, but just on the situation is clear. As of January 21, the withdrawal agreement, once ratified, contains legally binding commitments, and the protocol is very clear that UK authorities will be in charge if we're talking about good flows from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, for the application of the customs codes of the European Union, and for making sure that products that enter comply with the single market standards of the EU, be it in food, agri-food, industrial products, and what have you. So that's a very clear commitment, and the challenge for 2020 will be to work with the UK authorities. But irrespective of that work which we will take forward in terms of implementing the withdrawal agreement, there are clear commitments on the UK which are legally binding and which have to be implemented.
Ronan, would you
Just
like to
one
add?
tiny addition is that if Boris Johnson wishes to change his mind and to go for an extension, the EU loses competence to grant that if he doesn't do so by July. And he may, in his history, he makes kind of flips and changes at the last second, but he can't wait till the last second this time, because once we get past July, the EU can't give a further extension. So he's forced to make the political decision at the time when the actual consequences are still 6 months safely in the future, so it won't be as pressing. So I think
And only 4 months after he's passed the legislation which he says that he is not going to seek, cannot seek an extension to transition, which is why I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, we're starting to talk about breakdown of talks which still need to start. So let's just keep our calm for a second. First of all, on the question of sanctions or non-compliance, and I don't want to dwell too much on that. Like any international agreement, there is a dispute settlement mechanism. There is a role for the institutions of the European Union in the context of the Northern Irish Protocol. But I think I would prefer to put myself in the hypothesis that we will face a situation where the Joint Committee will do its work on Northern Ireland as it is foreseen during the 11 months ahead of us, and that on the other, and that's one element, and the second element to that is that the UK will abide by the commitments it has subscribed to. And this is first major international agreement of post-Brexit Britain, so I would certainly not want to put myself in the hypothesis that there is a non-compliance with the commitments that the UK has solemnly undertaken, and indeed is being ratified. The second, the fish.
Fish.
Sorry, yes, fish. It's a joint commitment, by the way, to try and conclude a fisheries agreement by the 30th of June 2020. It's not just an EU issue, it's a joint commitment and political declaration for the very good reason that as of January 21, when Britain will become an independent coastal state with control, with the control that comes with that, there is of course an issue of the fishing industry and clarity that is needed on the situation that the fishing industry will face. So hopefully, what I would say in the bigger picture is in 2020, we can come to a first agreement, I would say, because again, we cannot deal with everything in 2020 as in the political declaration. That is simply not realistic if the time is limited to the time that the government here has chosen. That we can conclude an economic partnership where the UK finds its interest reflected and where also the issue of the fisheries is part of that economic partnership in terms of zero tariff, zero quota access that the UK is and the EU are considering in the context of the future relationship. For us, we have always said that access to waters, access to markets are part of a thing we need to look at together. And as you know, a lot of the fisheries products from the UK are exported to the EU. The 30th of June, yes, absolutely, that's a firm deadline. I mean, the UK will no longer be a member as of the 1st of February, and so Article 50 applies to a withdrawing member state. The UK is no longer a withdrawing member state. The Article 50 legal basis is no longer there, and the withdrawal agreement is crystal clear, the 30th of June. If there has to be an extension of transition, will have to be decided by them with an appropriate financial contribution from the UK in case there is an extension of transition for continuing enjoying the benefits of EU policies and single market. In terms of the singular, I guess single agreement or salami kind of agreement, I think I prefer this kind of pasta where everything is integrated. So as a main course, and so therefore, I think we have an agreement with the UK to go for an overarching institutional framework where chapters and agreements are linked. That's in the political declaration that we have agreed with the UK, and that's what we will be striving for.
Thank you, Stefan. Pete, something to add?
Yes, I can't resist adding something on the firm deadline of the 1st of July. As Stefan very rightly pointed out, I mean, this is my academic view, Article 50 can no longer be used by the European Union as a legal basis. And I think that means that the withdrawal agreement is effectively an agreement which you cannot amend as it currently stands. It is always possible to do something else. It's always possible for parties to conclude a further agreement. So come November, the EU and the UK might decide in a further agreement we will have an extra transition period. But that's much more complex, I think, to negotiate, because that would have to be have to have all the member states as parties to it, because it's surely no longer within the EU's exclusive competence to agree with a non-member state for the application of the whole of EU law for another year. So you would be facing ratification of an agreement like that, not just by the EU, but by each individual member state going to national parliaments. And I can't see any appetite in the EU for even trying to that route, which wouldn't work by the end of the year, I think. So effectively, the legal position is that it's really difficult to see how this could be further extended.
Just to clarify, on WTO, do you mean generally? I'm going to defer to Pete on that. International on environmental protection is going to become really important, actually. And I think something like air quality, we have quite a good convention and quite a good international instrument across the European countries, including the UK, which will bind the UK up to a point. But most international treaties don't have the fine-grained level of regulatory detail that EU regulations do in environmental protection spheres, and more to the point, are not enforceable in the same way. So the Commission's enforcement machinery has been incredibly important, and the reaction of the UK government to threatened infraction proceedings on all sorts of environmental issues is what has changed the game, really. So I think even if you had the best treaties in the world, and we don't have treaties that are as granular or as that set environmental standards in the same way, whether it be wetlands, whether it be air quality, whether it be, even climate change, it's at a different level of legal obligation, but they will become more important, and the UK government will have to think very seriously about how it is going to think about its obligations for environmental protection under international environmental law, which it hasn't had to do because the EU's done that job for them. But on enforcement, I think is the real shift.
Thank you. Pete, do you want to go and speak about WTO?
Yes, in just a few words. It's a cold, hard world to trade on WTO terms. There's hardly any nation in the world which trades with the rest of the world on WTO terms. And for example, to give just one example, what would be immediately lost is all the export advantages which UK business now has in terms of the agreements, the free trade agreements which the EU has in force with, like Canada, Japan, so many countries around the world from which UK business exports. You lose all that, but what you also really lose is leverage, I think, because there are lots of rules in the WTO, but they are not very well enforced, and we see enormous backsliding in recent years with the Trump administration, which couldn't care less about the WTO and has made the dispute settlement system completely ineffective by refusing to appoint to the appellate body. So it's a completely different scenario in my view, because in the EU's internal market, any person can rely on their rights before any court. In the WTO, well, good luck, go to Geneva, see you back in a couple of years and see what comes of it. I mean, take Airbus Boeing, the dispute between the US and the EU. It's been ongoing for how many years? And nothing has really changed.
what I said in my introductory remarks is that we hope that the Council could adopt the negotiation directives on the 25th of February. And so as soon as that has happened, that means that the negotiations can be opened. Then we need to see with the UK what is the appropriate moment that but that is basically opens the door for us as Commission to start the negotiations formally. So as soon as that will have happened, then we hope that that would happen on the 25th of February. Your question on the UK's international trade agreements. The UK, of course, needs to start preparing its future at the end of transition. Right? I mean, as soon as the withdrawal agreement will have been signed, we will invite all third countries around the world to continue extending the benefits of EU agreements also to the UK. But that's for an 11-month period, so that means that as of January 21, the UK is no longer covered by the 60, they're not 60 agreements, but 60 countries with whom the EU has preferential trade deals. So clearly, it's common sense that also for the transition period we said, well, the UK needs to start preparing that and therefore start negotiating with other countries around the world future trade deals or other international agreements. It's up to the UK to decide which countries it wants to focus first, of course, in that. That's not up for the EU to comment on that. We will focus on the one we need to negotiate in our interest in terms of EU-UK future relationship. The only thing I would say is that during transition period there is of course a duty of sincere cooperation on the UK. And in any agreement that falls within the exclusive competence of the EU during the transition period, it needs to be authorized by the EU. But I guess these things take time, and therefore it's only normal that the UK starts preparing very, very quickly for a situation which is not easy for the UK, because we're talking about 600 plus international agreements that the UK will need to have ready and somehow reproduced as soon as the transition ends.
I do feel, and I tried to say this I think when I was speaking, that these two things are linked actually. I have no idea what the public are going to make of the coming year. There are clearly expectations about Brexit and its liberating effect, which might be rather dampened by having listened to this panel for the last 45 minutes. Now, we may be wrong. And of course, a Prime Minister who has a good gift of the gab can sometimes gloss over the realities of changes in terms of selling it to the public, so that the public end up actually rather quiescent. There are two divergent views here, are there not? One is that when the actual act of Brexit has taken place, a lot of people who wanted it will be largely assuaged by the mere fact that we're gone, and that therefore what happens after that they may not be very bothered about, and therefore won't pressurise their MPs at Westminster and say, you're not delivering what I wanted, because what they wanted was this departure because they saw the EU as a fetter, and they will live with all the other complexities and allow the Prime Minister and his government to sort them out. That's one vision. The other is that actually we are going to be enmeshed in complexities which make people realise that they have been shortchanged. And I think that is linked to the second for me, because rationally the Constitution and Rights Commission is a very ambitious project which is likely to enmesh the government in further controversy. Why should a government led by an idle Prime Minister, which is what he is, wish to get enmeshed in such controversy unless it is as a diversion from the problems which he himself has engendered by leaving the EU? And so I do see these two things as wholly intermingled. And I have no idea, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't wish to make a prediction as to how it will pan out, but politically, that's how I see these two things. And bear in mind that setting up constitution and rights commissions will be attractive to a very small minority of Conservative MPs, but most Conservative MPs probably remain Conservative, although I begin to wonder sometimes if some of them are. And by its very nature, Conservatives are not supposed to be wanting to overturn apple carts. But this is why we're in such a strange situation, because we do have a Conservative government that is carrying out revolutionary politics. And I don't know at what point that comes to an end. And this has been the message I've been trying to put across during the course of the last year, and I'm afraid probably rather unsuccessfully, because people don't want to look at the detail. So that, I think, is the interesting issue.
Thank you, Meg.
Well, I think I go along with a fair amount of that. I would say, I mean, this anger at the Supreme Court is primarily, of course, about the prorogation case. And what did the prorogation case do? To me, it upheld the power of Parliament. So this is a part of the strange mood that we are in, and you know there is good academic research showing the degree to which we have become a polarised nation along Leave, Remain lines. That this has become part of a fundamental part of people's identity, and they're taking sides on so many issues on the basis of which side of that divide they were on. And at the end of last year, I think this got very unhealthy, if it hadn't already, because they were taking sides on whether they supported Parliament and whether they supported the courts. And because the courts supported Parliament, people on one side of that divide decided that they didn't like the courts and they didn't like Parliament. And this is a very, very dangerous situation if we're sort of split down the middle in the country as to whether we support the courts and we support Parliament. So I think in terms of the Constitution, the proposed Constitution Commission, a sort of optimistic reading, I think, is that all of these problems are caused by a very unique set of circumstances, a minority government trying to deliver a controversial referendum result. That's all over now. The issues which caused all of this concern about the prerogative power and the power of Parliament and the power of the courts, we could just let it go. We've gone back to politics as normal with single-party majority government, so maybe we should just forget about it. But at the same time, tempers are very high, and as Dominic says, there are opportunities now. You know, we either try and bridge this divide, these identities, or we allow it to go to some quite dark places, and people exploit it for some very undesirable ends. And I think, you know, we need to make sure that it's not the latter path that we take by whatever best means we can.
Thank you. Ronan, anything slightly more cheerful to add?
Two tiny things. So first, the expansion in judicial review predated the establishment of the Supreme Court. So I don't see what changing the name back to the House of Lords Judicial Committee will do. Second thing is, there will be a change in enforcement, some degree of enforcement, particularly in fundamental rights. EU law is very strong on judicial enforcement. That will change within UK law, but that's just symptomatic of the fact that after nearly 50 years, unwinding EU law as part of British law is going to create enormous amounts of uncertainty for individuals and particularly for businesses. And the change made recently and today in the Act in Section 26, where now they've decided that instead of only the Supreme Court being able to overturn previous retained EU law, the government may allow lower courts to do the same, is needlessly aggravating the already high degree of uncertainty that this process creates for businesses and for people trying to plan their lives. That, I think, is a real scandal, because there's loads of uncertainty to manage and they've needlessly increased it.
So, a rather charged environment. Will we see lots of EU bashing, and what can the EU do to remedy that?
I mean, we are only responsible for our own attitude, not for the way we are depicted or perceived by some, or perceived and depicted, or perceived or depicted, who knows. I think we have always shown an attitude of patience during the Article 50 period, of staying calm, even when there was quite a bit of serious time pressure. And I would hope that I'm confident we will maintain that same attitude. How then others want to depict us, that's their responsibility. But we will stay patient, calm, even though time pressure will be quite significant. It's important to use the time we have to get it right. So, and I think we we will do that. What we will do is defend our own interests, obviously, and that's not. But I think there is so much mutual interest, if you think about it, between the EU and the UK. And there are many things we haven't talked about that touch on universities and mobility and those kind of issues, where we must be able to find common ground. I'll be very quick. I mean, we have negotiated this under the rules which we all agreed would apply to the withdrawal process, which is withdrawal taking into account a future relationship. So that is the legal basis, and for a future relationship, the UK needs to become a third country first before we can then adopt a mandate to have that negotiation. What will happen in 2020? Well, the first thing that needs to happen is we are working on the negotiation directives. So let's take some time to do that, to get that right, which is what we are focused on right now. This will be a comprehensive in their scope, which is also what the European Council asked us to do. Where we will get throughout the year, clearly not everything can be done. And then the question is what President von der Leyen raised, what are the priorities for this year? But you will allow me to say that it's too soon today to start talking about what that could potentially then be, except that I have answered to your colleague from Politico, of course, in terms of what we want as an overarching institutional framework. And that is the answer to your slice and dice question.
Thank you. Dominic.
The first question, of course, goes back to that famous Conservative Party manifesto of 2017, where if those of you who bother to go and look at it will see that the then Prime Minister Theresa May said that although she respected the fact that the EU would not be able to conclude a future relationship whilst we remained members, because we had to be negotiated with as a third country, because that was the requirement, she had anticipated and hoped that it might be possible to negotiate everything, so that in a sense we left on the 31st of January, but somehow on the 1st of February, a few seconds later, everything else was concluded. And of course, that would have had the merit that people would have had an understanding of what it was that they were going to before they went. Well, it hasn't happened. It was one of the reasons why, in fact, I eventually said we should have a second referendum. And my colleagues in Parliament didn't, or the Conservative majority, Conservative colleagues certainly didn't agree with that. It was a tiny minority who followed my view. But it was precisely because I could see that this was taking it into a political crisis. It had to be a judgment of history whether the EU's negotiating stance was the correct one to adopt. But I have to say that I thought it always made the likelihood of achieving a durable deal round which a consensus was arrived at and agreed at UK level extremely difficult. And the vassalage element sounded like a sort of Damocles over the whole of the future relationship. And that's one thing. That's why, in a sense, it's linked to the second question. I don't know. It would obviously be very much better if in the course of the next 11 months we come to a comprehensive future relationship which satisfies the EU and satisfies the United Kingdom. But as you may have sensed from the panel's responses, and something about the political dynamics at UK level, I happen to think that this may prove to be extremely difficult. So you're then left with two choices at the end. One choice is that the UK drops out on the 31st of December 2020 into a nothing relationship, apart from, interestingly, the withdrawal agreement with which we are still saddled. Quite important to understand that, with some constraints on our future operation in the Northern Ireland context, which governments might find rather irksome if there was no quid pro quo as a result of it, but then the EU would be losers in other ways as well. Or we end up with what I think it was Ivan Rogers, I may have misquoted him, suggested was a series of shallow deals designed to try to maintain free flow of goods, but actually in reality a prelude to further negotiations. Now, I can't speak for the EU. It's clearly not what the EU wants, and actually it's clearly not what the United Kingdom wants. But if the alternative is crashing out with nothing, then might that be a destination? Which of course raises the horrible prospect of Brexit continuing and going on and on and on. But then I've always rather thought that that was what was going to happen. But maybe I'm becoming too cynical and it will all sort itself out.
So very clearly it falls to me as the chair to provide a little bit of light relief at the end. If Brexit does go on and on and on, we will at least have the chance to hold many more Brexit what's next events. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you to our speakers for their wonderful contributions. And, well, until next time then. Thank you.